This is roll number 2 for the quarter-inch tape and side 2 for the audio cassettes.
The many actors and actresses that came to Normandy to entertain our troops, and they held a show right in this Normandy barn that was not too far from the fighting. And I found out later that the intermission had to be called when the shells came too close. Of course, all you had to do was point a camera at Robinson, and he acted. Soon we found ourselves in Rambouillet. Rambouillet was 52 kilometers from Paris and was the headquarters for all the correspondents that came there. We see Ernie Pyle again on the left, and George Stevens, the Hollywood director, myself, and of course Pete Carroll. It was shortly after these pictures were taken that Ernie Pyle decided to return back to the States and then went to the Pacific, where he was killed. George Stevens was a very well-known Hollywood director, I'm sure you recall, and he died only a few years ago. But practically every correspondent turned out to try to get into the city of Paris. But we found, as I said earlier, that the General Eisenhower had given permission to the 2nd French Armored Division to take the city of Paris, because the important thing was to destroy the enemy, and they didn't consider Paris as a target. It would delay them if they did try to take the city themselves. They wanted to circumvent the city because they wanted to give the honor to the French. General Leclerc was in command of the 2nd Armored Division, and he refused to let the correspondents accompany his force to get into the city, simply because he didn't want any shots made until he had the city secure. We were glad to see Paris because it was a city of great beauty, and we were amazed at the way the people turned out. And these are some of the shots taken on the first day of liberation. I just didn't nearly get enough of these shots because there was too much to do. And soon General de Gaulle came into the city and paraded down the Champs-Élysées. And here he is taking the salute and receiving some flowers from a French girl. It must be remembered that de Gaulle was not well known at this time, and very few people could listen to the radio reports that told about his work in England prior to crossing the Channel. But soon he became very popular. It seemed as though everybody in Paris turned out to see de Gaulle. And he was marching down the Champs-Élysées at this point, and it was a tremendous sight to see. Later in the day, our own troops paraded down the avenue, and this was something that made us all proud. And here's de Gaulle parading, and suddenly firing opened up from forces that were left behind, and they thought from the FFE and some of the fascists that were still in the city trying to panic the people. But if you stuck your head out a window, you were bound to lose it. And this went on continuously for several hours. In fact, I was in the middle of this thing, and these are shots that I took of people lying flat on the ground. They'd get under our car. We couldn't move the car while they were trying to get the people to stop shooting by raising white flags. But it went on continuously, and although it was small arm fire, de Gaulle just stood his ground. Mother wasn't taking any chances. But this is the way the streets of Paris looked on the day of liberation. They did catch some of these people who were responsible for the shooting, at least they told us that, and unfortunately they beat them to death right on the spot. It was a rather ugly sight to see, but somehow it was the war of nerves. Some of the buildings still contained Germans that were at headquarter points, and they were sworn at by the French. These are some shots made late in the day of the American troops marching through the streets of the city on their way to the front lines. Wherever we stopped, the French were there to trade champagne for cigarettes and to talk to us and find out what was going on. We were able to see the city it wasn't badly destroyed. There was some small arms fire. The lion lost his tail, but generally speaking, all the bridges were intact over the city, and this is the Opera House. And since it was my first trip to Paris, I enjoyed seeing the beautiful city of Paris. Soon the people of Paris were out parading again along the Champs-Élysées with their newfound liberty. We discovered that the Eiffel Tower, which was reported destroyed and used for arms, was still intact. And soon I managed to get permission to go up into the Eiffel Tower and see what it looked like from up above. But there was much to be done, and even though Paris looked beautiful, conditions were very poor. The railroads were practically destroyed. There was no way of bringing in food. In fact, when we were coming down the road, we saw large trucks waiting to get into the city, loaded with all kinds of foodstuffs to support the city, which was in dire need not only of food, but of coal, because at this time it was getting pretty cold. It was late in the year, and there was no way of getting supplies in. These are scenes from the Eiffel Tower showing the Seine and the buildings close to the Eiffel Tower. And we see some troops parading through the streets. But we had to move on, and soon I had to leave Paris and found myself in the countryside beyond Paris and went into Belgium, where I managed to get into Brussels. These are some scenes of the Auteuil racetrack, which we found was opened shortly after the liberation. This surprised everyone, but they made them close the track after a few days of meeting. But one of the things that did surprise everyone is how well dressed the French women were, and they had a way of using whatever they had to make themselves look really attractive. And I understand this annoyed some of the other Allied countries very much, to think that they could get by like that. They even opened up the art galleries along the streets, and we didn't know whether they were permitted to do this prior to our getting there, but they certainly opened up for business very shortly after we arrived. We found a painter at work in the old quarter of Paris, and shortly after leaving Paris, I was in an area called the Ardennes. And the reason I took some of these shots of the countryside, because the weather was turning cold and the trees were turning their fall colors. And this is the town of Houffalize, which was completely destroyed on the breakthrough that occurred and the attack on Bastogne. I was in Bastogne just a few days before the breakthrough and was fortunate enough to get out of there, not knowing about the attack, but I did think that this was a place that the enemy could hide troops, and they did. That's General Collins again, talking to General Morris Rose, who was in command of the 3rd Armored Division. This is General Rose on the left. General Rose was killed in Cologne. It was an unfortunate happening because they thought they had the place protected, but there were some enemy troops in the area, and he was shot. These are units of the 3rd Armored Division that were fighting the enemy, and we managed to get some shots of them as they were being entertained by German children. We had a tremendous reception all the way across France, but when we got to Germany, the reception was not there. All the homes in the German area had white flags in front of them as an indication, of course, of surrender. And the children here were actually on their way to school, and children everywhere look cute, and they're holding their ears because our guns are firing not far away, and they were just trying to avoid the noise. We found the Siegfried Line, as it was called, or the Dragon's Teeth, which were built again by slave labor, I'm told, And they were not a fortification against our tanks because our bulldozers took dirt and pushed it over the top of them and rode right over the top. But we found these fortifications stretched out from one end of Germany to the other, because somehow they felt that we'd perhaps get to Germany, and they were trying to keep us out, but they didn't succeed, of course. The war was moving rather rapidly at some points in Germany, and soon I found myself in the town of Aachen. Aachen was under fire when these pictures were taken. That's the reason the scenes are devoid of people. There were mortar shells passing over our heads all the time, and the enemy was holding the center of the city as we were making these shots, and we were just wondering how long the battle would take, and we discovered that the troops were just down behind that mold or that wreckage in the distance, and soon we discovered that these reserves were just a block or two behind the front line, and they were waiting to be called in. I was told later on that the captain you saw in the picture a moment ago, somebody in the audience knew him and said he was killed in the action that took place shortly after that. Well, after Aachen, I was invited to fly home, and this is something I was glad to be able to do, because here we see some of the cemeteries that were built on the Normandy beaches, above the beaches, and these are scenes of Berlin showing the tremendous damage that occurred in the city. The bombings were intense, and very little of Berlin was left standing. It shows that wars don't seem to prove very much except to destroy property and kill people. And we sometimes think that maybe one day we'll learn how to avoid wars, and perhaps we've made wars so deadly that we'll have to avoid them in the long run to stay alive. Soon I was able to photograph some of the events when General Eisenhower came back to the States and was greeted in Kansas City. These shots were made with a telephoto lens at quite a distance. Then I was able to visit the collection of some of the weapons the Germans used just after the invasion. This is the V-2 rocket that followed the V-1s. The V-1s were a terror weapon, and the V-2s were certainly the same, but that was the first time they used rockets, and they were able to shoot them great distances. The V-1s, and I heard many of them come overhead, were like a motorcycle engine, and whenever the motor stopped, it would cause the bomb to drop. The Germans had jet planes in the air before the war ended, and here is one that they actually used, and it showed a record of many American planes, and if you notice, 42 Russians were shot down by this plane before it was captured by our side. And in this exhibit, we see one of the Japanese kamikaze bombs that was on exhibition, and one of our pilots is trying it for size. And they didn't like the idea that you only had a one-way ticket, because they were intended to destroy the target they were after and the pilot with it. This plane, I was told, was built by the enemy to bomb New York, and it could fly the ocean and back, and they appropriately named it Alles Kaputt. Here we see some shots of what I call what the next war might look like, and this is the explosion of the atomic bomb in New Mexico. And I always like to feel when I show these pictures that perhaps it'll remind people that we ought to remember what World War II was like, and that World War III would be much worse. But I like to say that, repeat what one scientist aptly put it when he said, the atomic bomb is here to stay. The question is, are we? And that brings us to the end of our film, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Pictures of Plymouth, Bournemouth, English Channel.
Very familiar.
Very familiar. You remember it. Well, the pictures have lasted. They're beginning to fade, I'm afraid. And I guess in time, I fortunately have a print of it and try to keep them fresh as long as I can.
They're remarkable, I think.
Well, thank you, sir. These were shot, of course, at moments of relaxation. I did many thousands of feet in 35 millimeter, which were used in theatrical release. But you needed 4 hands to operate 2 cameras.
You must have had to guard your film, didn't you? Pretty closely.
Well, I have a little secret to tell about the film. I took along a limited amount of film, but the Signal Corps, whenever film was out of date, would not want to use it. If it was 1 day past the date line, they'd destroy it. And I managed to get some of it, and it proved to be perfectly usable, and I was able to get it. Some of the film was processed in England, and one roll that was very green was used in, was lost for a while, and then I had it processed and the color didn't come out as well. But they tell me that this is some of the few pictures that were made in color of the invasion. But the idea was to bring back pictures of some friends who are no longer with us anymore.
We appreciate it very much.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. I appreciate your kind attention.
Thank you. I'm ensconced in 951. I'll be there about 5:30, 6 o'clock. But Jerry and Floyd, could you come over to the executive conference room 951?